Well, welcome everyone to a conversation with Dr. Paul Ladouceur. I'm Geoffrey Ready, Director of Orthodox Christian Studies within the Faculty of Divinity at Trinity College, University of Toronto. I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Daniel Opperwall, who teaches in patristics and church history. And together we have shared many years now teaching alongside and working with, collaborating with Dr. Paul Ladouceur, who's a stalwart member of the Orthodox Theological Society in America, active participant over many years. Paul, let's get started I'm looking at this bibliographical list of your publications over many years that spans numerous books, about 80 articles, and not counting translations and book reviews and that sort of thing. But what stands out for me is one of the books, the first you published, called Chiefs and Politicians: The Politics of Regionalism in Northern Ghana. How does that square with the rest of the Orthodox theological writing that you've done over many years?
Thank you very much for this opportunity to review what I've been doing in the broad sense in terms of Orthodox writing and research over the last quarter century. You're starting at the beginning in the sense of my academic formation. I studied at the University of Sussex for my doctorate, doing field work in Ghana. The book that you mentioned is the publication of my thesis. So what this gave me, it was not so much in terms of the actual subject matter, but in terms of methodologies. In that doctorate, I was employed methodologies from history, from social sciences, especially sociology, that I was able to deploy then in the production of that book. Also economics. Which subsequently served me well when I turned to theology later in life. So I'd say what I retained from that served me the most was really methodological principles of how research is done, and the sort of the principles and methods that are used, that I was able to apply in a different field later in life.
As you moved into the realm of Orthodox theology, what were some of the factors that affected what you began to apply those research methods and approaches to? How did you choose your subject matter, and what governed your kind of choices of what you wanted to teach and write about?
Well, I did bring with me as well sort of other personal interests and tendencies. One of them was a very strong personal commitment to social justice that I carried as an individual from really background in government programs, particularly in the federal government of Canada and the World Health Organization, in the field of international development. So in the sort of social justice field. And this, I think, brought me to and a realization of the importance of universal principles. So a very strong commitment to universalism and inclusivism in terms of the human family, in terms of the human fate, which I think is very relevant in terms of Christian theology, anthropology, that underscored a lot of my research and writing subsequently.
As you moved, towards considering those themes in an Orthodox vein, were there certain authors or figures that you immediately resonated with?
Well, the ones that attracted me the most initially were the modern Orthodox figures such as, particularly from in the French environment, that I got to know quite well, not only on the theological side, such as Vladimir Lossky and George Florovsky, but also in a broader sense, Saint Maria of Paris, Elizabeth Bersigel, Miralat Borodin, Paul Evdokimov. These were modern figures, Orthodox theologians thoroughly committed to their faith, and yet engaged with modernity. Now, modernity here, as defined yeah, and lived in the early to the mid 20th century. But I found this extremely relevant and engaging characters. We were able to know a lot about these figures from a personal point of view because we have the tools available. We have lots of photographs. We know their biographies and we're able to see how, from a personal point of view, their very strong commitment to both orthodoxy and yet engaged with the modern world. I think this is one of the major themes that I felt would be one of my major themes to bring this better known in the Orthodox world.
Did you encounter those authors through further research, or at that point you were working with the World Health Organization and others, if I understand correctly?
I became Orthodox 30 years ago in 1994. I was no longer a full-time public servant. I had resigned to pursue spiritual things rather than continue in a normal conventional career in public service. So I was encountering these basically on my own, just from reading and also from to some extent moving in the environment that they had moved in themselves, particularly in Paris in the St. Sergius Institute. I got to know some of the figures, some of the then contemporary figures who were familiar with some of the older figures that I had mentioned, who are no longer with us. So this was the context in which I got to know Orthodoxy. To me, my contacts with Orthodoxy were basically in France and that whole French environment that I was able to of course, bring with me when I returned to Canada in 1996. And one of the areas that I worked on over the years was to try to bridge the gap between French Orthodoxy, which had already seen its most glorious period, if you like, in earlier decades, but was still very vibrant with the memories of the older generations that did so much to shape modern Orthodox theology and spirituality. I tried to act as a bridging figure between French Orthodoxy and Anglophone Orthodoxy. I mean, the center of Orthodoxy shifted from Paris to the United States, to New York especially, with the move of figures like George Florovsky and Father Alexander Schmemann and Father John Meyendorff from Paris to St. Vladimir's Institute, the sort of intellectual center of Orthodoxy, shifted to New York from Paris, where it had been in the interwar period.
For those who aren't aware, I mean, you are Francophone yourself, I know, which has been shaping to what you've done in terms of bridging those gaps.
Most of my actual research work was done subsequently after I returned
Yeah.
in 1996, and particularly after I launched the website, the Page Orthodoxe de la Transfiguration. At the time when I came back in 1996, I realized that there was no French language Orthodox website, so I decided to create one myself. And this was really my major work for close to a decade. Was bringing the website up to speed in terms of resource materials, primarily on the spirituality side, lesser extent on theology, to be a resource accessible to all, a stable website, and it certainly achieved a certain prominence for a long time, and it still is available at the peak of its popularity, if you like. The number of visits per year reached about 220,000, which is I think quite good for a highly specialized website. So it acts as a stable resource, but it allowed me to probe into different areas and different personalities. They're primarily modern figures, and then to write up about them on the website and present their own writings in an accessible fashion for those interested in orthodoxy, and also to act as a permanent resource in areas such as liturgical texts.
One of the sort of aspects of working in a popular medium like the web is you have to be very clear and organized and take relatively complex ideas and shape them in order that they can be digested by a popular audience. And would you say that there's somehow almost a key to your work overall in that process, that you've been able to kind of read widely, digest deeply, and then kind of organize material for people to be able to understand better, whether it's intellectual or spiritual work, theological works? Is this in some ways a key to everything that is Paul Ladouceur?
It's a very important one. I realized relatively early on in the process that I was able to assimilate a great deal of material, literary material, books and articles in a given subject area, and to organize it into a coherent framework to provide keys for understanding really complex intellectual movements and ideas. This lay behind some of my courses that I've given in our program, particularly the course on modern Orthodox theology, which is reflected in the book of the same title, Modern Orthodox Theology, which covers a very wide range, perhaps too wide a range, of material, but organized in a fashion that I think people can understand where different figures, where different theological figures and writings and fit into a broad framework between the Russian religious Renaissance and neo-patristic theology, major themes such as the revival of apophatic theology, the divine energies, theosis, how these fit into certainly my interpretation of this framework of modern Orthodox theology, which has been extremely rich. It's the general bibliography at the end of the book has close to 1,000 entries. And so it's not always easy to sort of see how does this fit into where does my book that I'm reading at the present time fit into this broad framework, and this is something I tried to do in that particular book and that particular course that I give on modern Orthodox theology.
It's really just been continually a tremendous service, like, to see your work doing that, because it strikes me that there's sort of an irony in a lot of Orthodox theological studies that the more recent stuff is often the least attended to, and there can be a lot of confusion, whether it's for students or even other scholars like all the rest of us. There can be a lot of fog around, what's going on in the mid 20th century, what's going on in the early 21st century. And your method, your way of approaching these things is just it's just so very, very useful and helpful and remarkable to, like, bring it all together. You have an incredible talent for sort of describing and summarizing and getting to the heart of the matter very quickly and efficiently, and creating those big broad contexts. It's definitely really impressive and really, really well valued.
Well, thank you very much, Dan. I have to give some credit to my mentor, whom I met only once in academic writing, Metropolitan Callistos Ware. When I started to read Metropolitan Callistos, I said, oh, now I understand where he's going all the time in his writing. He's very clear in his ideas, transmitting often very complex notions in a way that is understandable He sets out a framework for his writings, and I said, well, that's going to be my model. I will use that model in my writing, and I have. I have tried to use that as a way of sort of a methodological way of getting ideas across, often very complex, as you say. Just to give an example, for a long time, it was taken to be that there was an opposition in modern Orthodox theology between the Russian religious Renaissance, the great figures of Soloviev, Pavel Florensky, Bulgakov, versus neo-patristic theology, spearheaded by Father George Florovsky with Vladimir Lovsky and John Landorf and many others. And that sort of there had been a break somehow between these two. When we look a little bit more closely, we see that in fact, the younger theologians, the theologians associated with neo-patristic theology, learned their lessons from the older ones. They didn't agree with them in everything and went off in slightly different directions, but they took a lot of things from that older generation, including academic discipline, but even certain themes carried forward directly from one mode of theology, from one type of theology, into another. For example, in the areas of ecclesiology and ecumenism, human anthropology, the ideas were very much identical, and one can trace the ideas from the older generation of the Russian religious Renaissance into figures more modern figures such as Metropolitan John Zizioulas, virtually without a break, although often they don't acknowledge where they got their ideas from, but it's clear they got them from the older generation. So this is one of the areas where clear and unbiased thinking is necessary in order to see, how did we get to where we are now in terms of Orthodox thinking on key subjects that affect our interface with the modern world. I've mentioned a few, including in the areas of ecclesiology, which spills over into ecumenism, and anthropology, anything having to do with the human subject, which, as Kalsosware himself said, should be the main theme of Orthodox theology in the 21st century, is really the human person, anticipating, I think, very much the rise of machines, even all the way to artificial intelligence, and the impact that this has on human perceptions of ourselves, our relations with God, our relations with each other. So this is areas where I think it has been important to know what the background was to where we are now, so that we can deal with these contemporary issues.
One of the interesting things, I mean, you've mentioned several times now, focus on modern Orthodox figures and thought, but maybe one of the things we've taken for granted now, or a lot of people I talk to anyway within Orthodoxy take for granted, is that this focus isn't an opposition to an orthodoxy that's more ancient or more patristic and so forth, but actually a revival of it. We've forgotten nearly that for many centuries Gregory Palamas wasn't much spoken of in Orthodoxy until some of these so-called modern Orthodox figures revived hesychasm and the Philocalic tradition, what you call apophatic theology as well. Can you speak a little bit to that, the way that, although these are contemporary figures and very much engaged in the questions of today, they really do stand within a living tradition that needed a little bit of a boost, a little bit of a renewal within the 20th century. And so, for the so-called traditionalists today who counts a lot on patristic theology, hesychasm, essence energies dispute, etc., as part of their way of being orthodox, how much they are actually dependent on what you have called and studied, within modern orthodoxy.
Yes. Well, I mean, certainly, I think both the major ways of doing theology, the major uh, figures in modern Orthodox theology associated with the Russian religious Renaissance and neo-patristic theology contributed in their own ways, in slightly different ways, to making modern Orthodox theology so rich. For example, I would take the Russian religious Renaissance engagement with modernity. The figures were engaged with the problems of initially Russia, the Russian Empire, and then the Soviet Union from a Christian perspective at a time when their philosophical peers were mostly atheists or positivists, not at all interested in theistic solutions to modern problems. So they brought a Christian perspective into areas such as law and social justice, social legislation, very relevant issues for our days. The neo-patristic theology, as you mentioned, Father Geoffrey, sort of reached back and said, well, we have to resource ourselves more deeply in the wisdom of the fathers. Now, I don't see any contradiction between these two, not at all. George Florovsky himself, I think, has been largely misunderstood. His call to return to the fathers was not so much a call to return to patristic theology, but rather to the way that the fathers did theology. For example, grounding theology in Scripture, pointing to Christ as the center of theological thinking. This kind of sort of fundamental principle, which underlay a theological method, is, I think, what was useful and most useful in neo-patristic theology. He himself frequently derided what he called a theology of repetition, which consisted simply of repeating what the fathers said, even though they may have said it 17 or 18 centuries ago, thinking that will resolve all of our modern problems. No, he saw the fathers themselves as engaged in the in the context of their times, dealing with the issues of their times. And this is what he called for, was the application of a theological method similar to those, to them, engaged in the church to deal with these modern problems. So I think this has sort of been one of the underlying themes that I have worked on in my book and also other articles dealing with modern figures to show how they go about doing this, bridging the gap between patristic thinking and ideas and modern issues, but without simply stopping at patristic studies. Patristic studies are certainly useful, and we have the Orthodox have benefited from a very wide patristic revival in Christian theology, but not only Orthodox have been involved in this patristic revival, many Catholics and many Protestants have been as well. And we have benefited from this in the sense of the access to texts of the fathers have come largely from non-Orthodox sources. So we have had access to them and been able to draw on these and perhaps the most important for me in terms of the theological themes, as you point out, Father Geoffrey, the theology of the divine energies, a very key theology for understanding the basis of Christian and especially Orthodox spirituality, developed by Palamas in the 14th century. But after the fall of Constantinople in the 15th century, largely forgotten because it did not feature in Western theology. And it was only in the 20th century, beginning in the 1920s, really, that this theology was very visibly revived as an underpinning of both theology, Trinitarian theology, but also spirituality, very closely related to the theology and spirituality of theosis or deification, which is a centerpiece of Orthodox spirituality. So these are, again, I said, major themes that I have worked on and tried to bring to the forefront in my writings and public appearances in various fora over the last couple of decades.
So it's really fascinating to me how figures like Palamas and another one in my world that's really big is Maximus getting really picked back up in the 20th century. And there's all this interest, this fascination with certain figures who actually in the intervening centuries between their time and our time really weren't necessarily that big of a deal, which is something a lot of people don't really understand. But something about these authors, evidently, and we could go in that direction, but we don't need to. But something about some of these authors, like a Maximus, like a Palamas, is sparking people right now, which I think your work and what you were just discussing here really helps to elucidate how that it's a modern phenomenon of race so small. I wonder, do you see similar patterns in terms of spiritual praxis or modern spirituality, which is something else you've studied and taught?
Well, I think the key event in modern spirituality, if you want to sort of pinpoint one event, would be the publication of the Philokalia in 1782. I mean, that to me is really crucial to kicking off a whole spiritual movement, especially in the Slavic world in the 19th century. And we sort of talk about ramifications of that in figures such as Saint Seraphim Seraph or the elders of the monastery of Optimo. But I think we are still, in a sense, in the effects of this philocalic revival of hesychastic spirituality, with its strong focus on the Jesus prayer. This is still we're still feeling this today, in part because of translations in modern Western languages of the Philokalia. Of course, the Philokalia was written in English, and English was written in Greek. It was an anthology of Greek texts, initially translated into Slavonic shortly after its publication in Greek, and then later in the 19th century in Russian, and sort of inspired this whole movement in Russian monasteries of spiritual direction and guidance and inner prayer. So I mentioned some of the key figures, but we have more popular end of it, the Russian pilgrim, which has probably had more impact in making orthodoxy known, Orthodox spirituality known, than dozens of learned textbooks on Orthodox spirituality. This is the simple book of the Russian Pilgrim, which was first translated into English and other Western European languages in the late 1920s and early 1930s. So this has been certainly on the spirituality side, if we make the artificial distinction between theology and spirituality, which we should not make, but for academic reasons, we tend to make that distinction. The key event was that, and sort of echoed all the way through the monastic revival on Mount Athos in the late 20th century, the sort of underlying basic spirituality is hesychastic spirituality, founded in the texts in the Philokalia. I mean, a figure such as Saint Silouan of Athos is a high point of this hesychastic spirituality. A simple, uneducated Russian monk who displays a highest degree of spirituality in a very direct, simple way, biblical way, liturgical way that is understandable by people at any level of education or spirituality. Can understand what he's saying because it's so direct, personal, and intimate. Though to me that is the major theme of Orthodox spirituality, which has now spread much beyond the Orthodox world. Sometimes Orthodox will shake their heads at, we're finding the Jesus prayer in all kinds of unexpected locations, Roman Catholic monasteries, or even Protestant circles. There may be arguments within the charismatic movement, the Pentecostal movement. Well, what is the value of the Jesus prayer? Where did the Jesus prayer come from? Well, it came from the hesychastic tradition revived by the Philokalia. So it said, the cat is out of the bag in this respect, particularly with respect to the Jesus prayer, whether we like it or not. So this is reflected in courses that I've been giving in modern Orthodox spirituality, and now in the manuscript of a book that I'm preparing on modern Orthodox spirituality. So as a kind of a parallel to the modern Orthodox theology, but as I said, I dislike the fact that it's in two separate volumes, but for academic and writing reasons, it's necessary to have some distinction between these two spheres.
You should publish them as a volume 1 and 2 that you can't buy separately or something.
Something like that, yes.
Box set, yeah, for real.
So you mentioned amongst the different figures there in terms of that hesychastic revival, the philocalic revival, and so forth, the importance of the kind of ordinary figure like a Russian pilgrim learning the Jesus prayer, or even a simple monk like Silouan, who now we think of as a towering spiritual figure. But you're right, it was a humble, uneducated monk in many respects. But amongst the people you focused on are also just lay people and even lay women in particular. I'm thinking of people like Elizabeth Bersigel, Miralot Borodin, Maria of Paris, who has an unconventional kind of monastic trajectory as an Orthodox nun. What is it about the way that these kinds of figures have been able to kind of exemplify, express, embody that philocalic spirituality that's so attracted you, and you focused on them, and how are they important for us today?
Well, I think this is one of the problem areas of the Orthodox tradition, is that there's not insignificant recognition given to the fact that women are half the members of the church, and often the most committed and devoted members of the church. I put this in sort of under the heading, and one of the headings in my work of social justice. We don't, well, we say that yes, men and women are equal, and then we do something different when it comes to the church. So my promotion of women figures is partly try to redress this imbalance. Particularly, well, Saint Maria of Paris is an easy one because of the totally unconventional nature of her life. Probably the last candidate that we would ever consider to be for canonization until the last few years of her life, when she was obvious that she was giving herself totally body and soul for the poor and ultimately the oppressed Jews occupied Paris during the German regime in Paris. I think that others that you mentioned, Elizabeth Bercigel's role in very explicitly trying to promote a rethinking of the place of women in the Orthodox Church, and again in the latter years of her life. I mean, she started working on this theme, I think, when she was 60 years old, and it was her major theme for the rest of her life. But she had other interests before that. Mirella Borden is another another category. She was a very well-known figure in non-Orthodox circles in Paris in the interwar period, the late 1930s and 1940s and 50s, but very little regarded in Orthodox circles. She was, I think, a key figure in the revival of some of the major themes of neo-patristic theology, particularly theosis. She wrote 3 key articles that were published in French in Catholic journals in the mid-1930s, long before Vladimir Lossky got around to looking at the subject. And these had a very powerful impact on the development of Roman Catholic theology in the interwar period when it came to the relationship precisely between theology and spirituality. But her role has not been adequately recognized by Orthodox. So there's several figures, Father Andrew Louth, Norman Russell, who have been trying to say that, well, we've overlooked somebody here. We've overlooked somebody very important in modern Orthodox theology. And I have to be frank, I have to think it is partly because she was a woman, that her role has been downplayed. So I am working to try to produce English translations of some of her writings, some of her key writings, to redress this imbalance, I think, with respect to Mirella Borden. But I think Orthodoxy is today very well served by a whole younger generation of women theologians, certainly in the West, to some extent in some countries of Orthodox traditions, such as Greece, perhaps well-known, a little bit less well-known than the figures that I mentioned, but nonetheless doing important work in a whole variety of fields. So this is one area where I think, even without addressing the contentious issue of the ordination of women, we need to recognize that in Orthodox theology and in the church generally, women have and continue to play important roles that should be recognized.
For you, that connects, I think, to the wider question of spirituality of the laity and other figures, even within that Parisian Orthodox milieu of the first half of the 20th century, were sort of instrumental, weren't they, in kind of reviving the sense that the lay people are ordained, by their baptism into the people of God and have a ministry and have a place in liturgy and all of that kind of thinking. I mean, it's all part of a larger theological, spiritual puzzle here, right?
Well, these are very much themes within the Parisian movement that spread much more widely, and what you mentioned, Father Geoffrey, are very much themes of Paul Ladouceur in particular. I call him the theologian of the laity. He developed a theology of the laity and how the laity fit into the church, what their role is. One of the problems, I think, of Orthodox spirituality is how to translate these ancient texts that feature in the Philokalia, written basically by monastics, for monastics, and yet having universal value, how to translate these into language and practices that make sense for lay people, lay Orthodox living in the world. And certainly Paul Ladouceur was a pioneer in this work, in his various books, The Ages of the Spiritual Life, The Theology of Love on marriage, where he attempted to bridge the language, the ancient language, um, with the needs of lay people in the world, and I think that this is what others as well. I mean, Saint Maria of Paris functioned in an environment which was very much a lay environment, social commitment, social action. Um, we need, in fact, more examples like these, but they are available and worthy of further attention on our part.
Yeah. So one of the other things that strikes me that is salient and sort of happening in that engagement with modernity is this question of both other religions as well as other churches, ecumenism, how the Orthodox Church interacts. And you've done a lot of very interesting work on that. I wonder if you want to say a bit more about it.
Well, I mean, my basic conviction is that Orthodoxy, the Orthodox Church, the Orthodox tradition, contains the fullness of the Christian tradition, the Christian revelation. And I use that word fullness very deliberately. I'm not the first that's used that word. It opens the door to the fact that other Christian denominations also possess aspects, and even very large aspects, of that tradition of the Christian truth, and yet there's something missing in them, and this opens the door to me to ecumenical dialogue, both to discover what is the truth in non-Orthodox Christian traditions, and sort of where are they lacking in an honest point of view. It's not, to me, the idea of ecumenism is not conversion. That might be nice, but it's not the objective. The objective is witness. We will witness to the truth, and we should witness to the truth, and not only in words, but also in actions and what we do. And that's sometimes we're Orthodox perhaps are not less successful. So in terms of my own personal commitment, I've been involved in both multilateral and bilateral ecumenical work, multilateral through membership in the Canadian Council of Churches, representing the Archdiocese of Canada, the Orthodox Church in America, especially on the Faith and Witness Commission, which is the theological commission of the Canadian Council of Churches, and also in bilateral in the Orthodox Pentecostal academic dialogue. At first blush, you might say, well, what on earth can Orthodox and Pentecostals have to say to each other? Well, as it turns out, it's quite a lot. The dialogue got off to a bit of a rocky start at the beginning, but then decided that the best format was as an academic dialogue. So the persons who sit on this sit as in their own right, not as formal representatives of their churches, which allows us to speak very honestly, very forthcomingly, without realizing, without thinking that we're engaging our churches in this. And it has been quite successful the last 7 or 8 years. Only meets once a year, but in fact, we've been able to build understanding and bridges between Orthodoxy and Pentecostals in a number of key theological and spiritual areas. So being a bunch of academics, of course, we like to write things up and have them published. The individual papers have been published in the Journal of Pentecostal Theology, and we're hoping that there will be a volume, another book, that will gather all of the articles that have been produced in the last 6 years, together with a concluding overall thematic summary of the different issues that we've looked at, that will be published in a single volume. So a personal commitment to, I would say, humanism in line with, I'd say, a more theological commitment to the principle of ecumenism. So that's a very important. It's been a very important aspect of my life for the last 10 years or so.
I think it's just significant to me to highlight that, and it's not just theoretical for you. You've been involved in the Canadian Council of Churches, and I feel like a lot of your work tends in that direction. At our own parish, we welcomed you to talk for lay folks on St. Maria's Parish. I know you've done that kind of work in other parishes as well. And I really appreciate it and have always valued about your work the way you are attentive to bringing it out. You started off at the beginning of this conversation mentioning your interest in social justice, and it just seems to me that part of this is not, making sure it's not just on a page, but is brought forth and is living in what we do as scholars. And it strikes me that you
I certainly have greatly appreciated the opportunities of the last years, especially to speak with parishes. Major interest has been in St. Maria of Paris, but other subjects as well. And I think it's important for scholars to do this, to get out of the academic mode and bring forth their knowledge and to adapt our often high-flying ideas to a level that it will be comprehensible and valuable to people in the pew.
What are you working on currently, Paul? You've got some pretty major projects wrapping up, as I understand it.
Well, I do. The major one mentioned a little bit earlier, Dan, was completing the manuscript on modern Orthodox spirituality. It's kind of been an underlying theme for the last 20 years. My first course that I taught both in Montreal and in Toronto was on that subject. So I've been struggling with it to bring it into a manuscript form. It's now quite well advanced. I'm currently dealing with a chapter on North America. It's an area it's difficult to write on because there are not very many guidelines, to say the least. Not many precedents. Sort of, what do you write about when you want to write about Orthodox spirituality in North America, for example? So that's a major one that I hope to be able to finish in the coming months, the initial manuscript. Another one is a very large project of translations of Father Sergius Bulgakov's writings. We call them writings in exile, beginning 1918. Now, of course, Bulgakov's major works, his monographs, are all translated into English. And many other works from that period, but many are not translated and are still exist only in Russian versions in obscure journals of the 1930s, or perhaps were published in English in the same period. So I'm working with a team of translators to bring all of these translations together in one series. It's really quite a mammoth project. I'm working with 4 translators. The most well-known of whom is Thomas Allen Smith, who's a very well-known translator of Bulgakov already, who translates Bulgakov in his spare time. And this will result, the project will result in 4 volumes of probably 500 plus pages each, sort of an encyclopedia of Bulgakov's occasional writings as a complement to his major monographs, which said have all already been published in English translation. So again, this is part of an effort to make what I consider to be the most profound Orthodox thinker of modern times more well known in the English-speaking world. I use the language there very carefully. The most profound Orthodox thinker, not always the one that we would agree with, but certainly the one who provokes and forces us to define our positions on a whole wide range of theological subjects. His theological scope is just absolutely enormous, much greater than that of George Florovsky. Florovsky had certainly more impact. Florovsky was, in my view, the most influential Orthodox theologian of the 20th century, but not necessarily the most profound one. For that, we have to look, I think, to Bulgakov. So this is another major project that I'm engaged with translators, very good translators, specialize themselves in Bulgakov. And another one is the one on Mirlat Borodin. Again, translations, some of which I have done myself of her work. You may think, well, for me, it should be easy to translate from French to English. Well, her French is so unusual that it's actually quite difficult to translate. It's highly poetic. Her major field was medieval studies, specializing in medieval romantic literature, on which she wrote several books before she turned to theology. So her language sort of reflects, to some extent, this poetic, imaginative background of her main professional area. And I said it makes for very good reading in French, but very difficult to translate into English because of its sort of lyrical quality to it. So I'm working with another translator and correctors to try to convey this work of her most important theological essays, as said, in areas of deification, free will and grace, and beatitude, the life beyond what is what was patristic thinking of the kingdom. The kingdom would come. This is one of her last essays was on this subject. Again, some of the language is just pure poetry, virtually. So anyway, this is an attempt to make her more well known and appreciated, her role in modern Orthodox theology. So those are some of the major issues. Perhaps I should mention as well, my interest in universalism that I mentioned right at the beginning extends beyond Christianity to non-Christian religions. My sense has always been that God provides for the salvation of all humanity, of all humans. This has a good biblical grounding to it, but we sometimes tend to think of salvation in terms of Christians, or more narrowly even Orthodox. And yet, what about all of the rest of humanity? So I've always had an interest in non-Christian religions, and I've been working with two colleagues, Brandon Gallagher and Thomas Gatoy, to edit a book of writings on the subject of Orthodox approaches to non-Christian religions, especially in the context of comparative theology as a theological method of thinking about non-Christian religion. So that's another area which, again, this book is nearing, the manuscript is nearing completion. So those are some of the major areas that I'm still working on.
You're just so incredibly prolific, Paul. I mean, the ground you covered, it as you're a translator, you're working on what, 3 books you said now? They're all going to be fantastic, and all of your work to this point is fantastic. From northern Ghana all the way to, I mean, arguably the leading expert uh, on on the planet, as far as I'm concerned, with respect to these issues of modern Orthodox theology, modern Orthodox spirituality, and what's been going on, and finding all those patterns. It just blows me away. I just wanted to say that is all. I just yeah, I couldn't possibly admire you more in terms of that incredible drive and energy and work that you do in so across so many fields.
Well, thank you very much for that, Dan. I would think I would have to share this honors with a number of other people who've been working in the same direction to ensure that Orthodoxy engages with the modern world rather than retreating from it. And that's always the temptation, and I think that temptation has increased in recent years. There are a number of others who are working in this area. The figure that I often go back to as a kind of a prophet of orthodoxy and modernity is a very little known Russian theologian of the late 19th century called Alexander Bukharev. Now, Alexander Bukharev was originally a monk, actually, who felt the necessity for the Russian Orthodox Church to engage with the emerging modern culture of the late 19th century in Russia, which the church was inclined to withdraw from it. And he felt that the only way that he could convey this message accurately was in effect by being laicized, which he was. Said he was largely forgotten in his own lifetime, but then revived by some of the figures, particularly Pavel Florensky, of the Russian religious Renaissance. And I think his message is still very relevant today. I mean, in 1860, he published a book of essays, called Orthodoxy and the Modern World. How relevant can we get more than a century and a half later? How well or not so well have we fulfilled his call for Orthodoxy not to be afraid of the modern world, but to use the tools that we have available to us from the patristic era, from the modern Orthodox era, precisely to engage, fully committed to Orthodoxy, but to define how Orthodoxy needs to relate to modernity in all its aspects.
Well, I want to echo Dan's appreciation for all you've done. I mean, I think especially of the way you brought figures, particularly from that Parisian milieu, and others from the first half of the 20th century, almost bringing them to life. I feel like I know people like Marie of Paris through you. I know, people like Elizabeth Bersigel or even Saint Silouan, etc. I want to thank you for the translations you've made available and the way you kind of bridge that Francophone and Anglophone, world, as well as the assisting in other translations. About the encyclopedic dictionary-like text that we have access to, so I can go and look stuff up if I need to situate figures from modern Orthodox theology or spirituality within a timeline and a development and their kind of context and relationship to the world. And just the way you've modeled, how you can take complex theological, spiritual texts and make them available for students, the kind of teaching approach that you've modeled and made available both through our program and elsewhere. And really, it has been a real honor to have shared time and space with you over the last few years and to really benefit from all the work that you've done. So a real tremendous thank you for all your labors. Know that they are not unappreciated, and we are tremendously grateful for everything that you have done, and thank you for your time today in discussing these aspects of your scholarship with us, which has had a long and prolific and wide encompassing trajectory, but really some clear through lines, really, which are properly inspiring for the rest of us. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Father Geoffrey and Professor Dan Opperwall, for the opportunity of this conversation and the opportunity for me to look a little bit on the past 25 years or so, where I have gone and devoted my energies, the major themes of my research and writings. Thank you very much.